Adolf climbed the dimly lit staircase, was met by a husky gentleman on the landing. With polite uneasiness, Adolf inquired as to where the concert was being held. The man asked Adolf to follow him. The room to which he was shown was nearly devoid of furnishings and was almost completely dark, and yet there was another man waiting, and now Adolf knew. He demanded to be released immediately. The men laughed. Adolf picked up a chair, threatened to smash the window if he were not let go at once, but the men moved toward him. So in desperation, Adolf hurled the chair into the window glass. From the street below came the voice of a passing policeman. "What's going on up there?" And the would-be assassins fled. And because Adolf escaped that night, a world would never be the same. The world of music. Because the infamous Adolf, whose most perilous hour you've just relived, was not the infamous Adolf you know. This Adolf was an inventor, a maker of musical instruments. That's right. And his enemies, who had formed an alliance throughout Europe, were rival instrument makers. You see, the ill-tempered innovator who once nearly paid for his genius with his own life, he was Adolf Sax. And the instrument he invented in the 1840s, the
world went up in
wind,
flames.
some believed, was worth murdering to silence.
It is only now, it is this tardily,
was the
that we are sifting
saxophone.
the ashes of those horror times.
Only now you know
That we, the triumphant
rest
free,
of the story.
try
The
to...
rest of the story. Even as a young man, now listen carefully, even as a young man taking his first steps on the road to infamy,
as
Adolf
were the women who loved him.
had enemies.
And illness aside,
In fact, there was a full-fledged organized society with a president, a secretary, a treasurer, an alliance with branches in several countries, the avowed purpose of which was to discredit Adolf, and at least once that we know of, they tried to kill him. Adolf knew that his enemies were organized, that they had formed an alliance throughout Europe, administered by a president, a treasurer, a secretary, even a legal advisor. Adolf was growing too powerful, they reasoned. He would have to be stopped while there was still time. His friends warned him of this society's ultimate intention, that if Adolf could not be discredited, he would have to be eliminated. Adolf, feeling secure in his position of increasing influence, laughed at the suggestion. Surely if his enemies wanted to assassinate him, they would have seized on many past opportunities. But then one winter, Adolf received a letter requesting his distinguished presence at a local concert. Again, his comrades warned him of the potential danger. Adolf did not know these people who were inviting him. He must ignore their flattery or risk being led into a trap, and yet, with the arrogant temper for which he was already infamous, Adolf rejected the apprehensions of his friends. He played directly into the hands of his enemies. On the appointed evening, Adolf, with no guards accompanying him, none at all, arrived at the specific downtown address. He paid the cabbie. He proceeded to the front door of the building. He was greeted by an elderly woman. Certainly no danger there, he thought. Second floor, the woman said. Adolf climbed the dimly lit staircase, was met by a husky gentleman on the landing. No guards with accompanying him. None at all. Arrived as to where the concert downtown address. He paid the cabbie. He proceeded to the front door of the building to which he was shown was nearly devoid of furnishings, almost completely dark, and there was another man waiting. Now Adolf knew. He demanded to be released immediately. The men laughed. So, Adolf picked up a chair, threatened to smash the window if they didn't let him go at once. Instead, the men moved toward him, so Adolf hurled the chair into the window glass. From down on the street below, the voice of a passing policeman called out, "What's going on up there?" The would-be assassins fled. Adolf escaped, and the world would never be the same. the world of music, that is. This Adolf was an inventor, a maker of musical instruments. And his enemies, who had formed an alliance throughout all Europe, were rival instrument makers. For the ill-tempered innovator who once nearly paid for his genius with his life was Adolf Sax. And the instrument he invented, the ill wind some believed was worth murdering to silence, was the saxophone. Now you know the rest of the story.
The rest of the story. Guido Casolati was a much-respected voice teacher and opera coach. His wife, Maria, was an opera star. Guido's home and studio were in a large Spanish-style apartment building, occupied mostly by musicians. So distinguished was Guido Casolati in his field that impresarios and producers in search of certain voices often called him for advice. One such gentleman, Roy Scott, telephoned Guido at 10 o'clock on a beautiful spring morning. Mr. Scott explained to the maestro that he was casting a particular role. He needed a young girl, preferably about 14, who had had operatic training. Might Guido suggest anyone? Well, Maestro Casolati paused for a moment, considering the many talented youngsters among his students, when suddenly a small voice was heard on the telephone line. "How about me?" the voice said. It was Guido's daughter, Adriana, who had been quietly listening to the conversation on an upstairs extension. Sternly, Daddy admonished the girl for eavesdropping, insisted that she get off the telephone at once. It ought to be mentioned at this point that Adriana had always been a well-behaved child, so you'll appreciate how entirely uncharacteristic it was when she then and there, without a moment's hesitation, disobeyed her father. I mean, right there on the telephone, Adriana started singing. Embarrassed, Maestro Casolati began apologizing for his daughter. "Nonsense," said Mr. Scott. "Please allow her to continue." And Adriana continued to sing. And when she was finished, Mr. Scott confessed that he was much impressed. Naturally, the young lady would have an audition in person. A great many talented youngsters would be trying out for the same role. Adriana was so elated that she hardly minded the further scolding from her father. "Please, Daddy, please. Could she please try out?" And finally, Daddy gave his consent. Adriana auditioned, and she got the part. But this is the rest of the story. When Maestro Casolati's daughter broke in on that telephone conversation and started singing, insisting that she was perfect for the role of a 14-year young girl, she, Adriana, was then 18 and a half. The auditions took so long she was almost 20 before she was chosen from a field of 150 auditioning. And by the time the production itself was completed, Adriana, taking the part of a 14-year-old, mind you, was age 21. But it was to be the greatest role of Adriana's life. As a matter of fact, it was her only success in show business. And yet, over the past almost 50 years, generation after generation of children of all ages have listened to the magical voice, speaking and singing, the voice which interrupted a telephone conversation one spring morning back in 1935. Adriana's face was then and is now unknown, but her voice is little changed from that of the Walt Disney animation, which she helped to bring to life. For you see, the voice of Adriana Casolati, the maestro's daughter, is a voice unchanged and unchanging forever. The voice of Snow White. And now you know the rest of the story.
The rest of the story. Just when you think you can't improve on something, well, Adrian Nicholas thought that he had a better parachute, more durable certainly, and just as surely more interesting, but would it fly? 24 feet square, canvas poles, ropes. The contraption was 40 times heavier than most parachutes. It would have been convenient to have dismissed Adrian Nicholas as an attention-seeking dilettante, except that he was one of Britain's top skydivers, holder of all kinds of world records, including the farthest unassisted human flight, 10 miles, the longest free fall, nearly 46 minutes. So Adrian Nicholas was no fool, and he was completely serious about and confident in this remarkable, if untried, parachute design. The only thing left was to try it. The date, June 26, 2000, the place Kruger National Park in South Africa. The latest word from the experts was that the experiment would fail. The giant cloth pyramid would tip over, perhaps spin out of control, or even fall apart due to unabsorbable stresses. But Adrian was determined. So at the appointed hour, a hot air balloon rose majestically into the African sky, hoisting the 38-year-old adventurer and his unique craft along with it. He could see the fruit groves stretching into the distance beneath him, then slowly the rest of the park. It was beautiful, but soon, as observer helicopters cruised near, Adrian began to realize the risk he was taking. 5,000 feet, 8,000, 10,000 feet above the groves, the wilds, they were in the departure zone. It was time. So at Adrian's signal, the harness was released, and a moment later the parachute was floating, free. Attached to Adrian's fleece-lined jacket were a video camera, a cell phone, a walkie-talkie, even a black box to monitor his descent. So if he didn't make it, at least the world would know why. But down, down like a soaring creature from some fantastic fairy tale or a seed pod from an Olympian tree. Down, down, a mile or more, and then safely to rest. The flight of Adrian Nicholas had been a rousing success. The design of his parachute had been proved, but the design was not his. I said the design of the parachute was not his design. Oh, the device had not been tested, not ever before. But it was scarcely brand new. For as Adrian prepared to launch it and himself into an uncharted ocean of air 2 miles over South Africa, one thought possessed him, that it took one of the greatest minds in all history to conceive of that contraption. But it took more than 500 years to find a man with a brain small enough to try it out. For you see, the parachute on which Adrian had bet his life until he had built it according to original specifications and from Renaissance vintage materials, until then that parachute had been no more than a hastily scrawled sketch in a notebook dated 1485. It had been the whim of a multi-talented Italian master painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, and scientist named Leonardo da Vinci. And now you know the rest of the story. The rest of the story. The history books have been telling you all your life that once upon a time, many centuries ago, on the Aegean island of Samos, there was a certain slave, and we are told that he was born in Phrygia about 620 BC, that he was brought to Athens as a boy, and there, the story goes, he was sold to a man named Ladman, who took him thence to his island home. Now, Samos, just off the coast of Asia Minor, is a small but prestigious piece of real estate, remembered down through the ages as birthplace of the mathematician Pythagoras, home of the poet Anacreon, dominion of the infamous conqueror Polycrates. But students for more than 2,000 years have recalled and revered the island of Samos because there resided this humble slave, whose master quickly learned of the lad's gift for storytelling and whose freedom was thereby eventually granted. Further, we are told, the former slave traveled far and wide, reciting his charming tales wherever he went. He even spent a wonderful while in Lydia, in the court of Croesus, as the king's advisor. Of what happened after that, very little is recorded. Some say the one-time slave of Ladman of Samos lived an adventurous life and died at Delphi. Of course, you know the spellbinding storyteller of long ago by the solitary name for which he is world-renowned, Aesop. You've heard of Aesop's fables all your life, but this is the rest of the story.
Now, history is no better, no worse, no more reliable, no less than the historian who records it. And so it is because rest of the stories must be based on historical consensus. We investigate all of the original sources from which the details of Aesop's life have been derived. And what we've learned in the process is most intriguing. The earliest recorded mention of Aesop anywhere was inscribed a century after he was presumed to have died. Herodotus is the reporter of fact in this case. And while he refers to Aesop as a slave, he presents posterity with scant information otherwise. The first known collection of Aesop's stories was produced fully 100 years after that. The compiler was one Demetrius Valerius. Not one syllable from that early anthology has survived. Now more centuries pass. Plutarch, in the 1st century A.D., embellishes Aesop's still vacuous biography with an allusion to his tenure in the court of Croesus. It's only thereafter that the tales with which we are now so familiar begin to surface in manuscript form. By the Renaissance, scholars are presented with so many different versions of Aesop's life experiences that they begin to conclude the one fact with which most serious scholars are now prepared to agree. In all probability, Aesop the storyteller never existed at all. Never existed at all. That he was merely an invented name, an imaginary author, to whom a wealth of ancient folk wisdom, hand-me-down stories, were conveniently ascribed. Now, what all of this means is that the final, indeed the most remarkable of what we now call Aesop's fables, was Aesop himself, the man who never was. Now you know the rest of the story. The rest of the story. Duncan Kearns is a commercial pilot for Northwest Airlines, and he's a major in the South Dakota Air National Guard. One of Major Kearns' best friends in Sioux Falls is 41-year-old Ward Bushy, and all of his life, Ward's been afraid of flying. For years, the major has been telling his friend that if he were better acquainted with airplanes, he might even become fond of air travel, but Ward's answer has always been, oh, yes, sure. Yet a few weeks ago, it was the springtime of this year, he finally took Major Kearns up on an intriguing offer. The major would arrange permission for Ward to accompany him on a flight in the cockpit of an A-7K fighter jet. Ward would have to go through a little training to qualify for the privilege, but Major Kearns promised his friend it would be the adventure of a lifetime. Well, that prediction came true. But, well, this is the rest of the story. Egress Familiarization Training, it was called. More plainly, instruction in the use of the ejector seat. But why did Ward have to know about that, he wanted to know? A mere formality, he was told. Then came the exciting day. Ward's wife and young children were at the National Guard airfield to smile and to wave. Daddy, anxious but exhilarated, climbed into the rear seat of the A-7K, and with his friend Major Kearns, blasted into the stratosphere above Sioux Falls. First, they flew in close formation with 3 other fighters. No need to be concerned, Ward told himself. These were crack military pilots. With a civilian along for the ride, they would take no chances. Major Kearns maneuvered his craft through a delicate mid-air refueling exercise, but now his friend Ward was only a little nervous. Then came the mock dogfights. Suddenly everything went into high gear. All 4 planes performing incredible aerobatics, loops and dives and surges and inverted flight, and Ward looked down and one of the other fighters was overtaking Kearns' plane from below. Ward could see the other pilot's head in the cockpit, and then his eyes, then the whites of them, and then an awful thud. The planes collided in midair. Major Kearns mashed the eject button, sending himself and his panic-stricken passenger out into space. At 20,000 feet, their chutes opened, the flaming wreckage of 2 A-7Ks tumbling below them. Luckily, they were over an expanse of farmland. Ward and both pilots returned to Earth more or less safely. The pilots were practically uninjured. Their civilian tag-along suffered some facial cuts, a fractured neck vertebrae, and some burns. Actually, he'd been on fire until his free fall smothered the flames. Well, Ward Bushy says he'll get over it, and he may still fly commercial if he has to. But probably he will never really overcome his antipathy for flying. And that's not the best of all news for the South Dakota Air National Guard, because you see, not long before Ward's big adventure, a local journalist, the executive editor of the Sioux Falls Argus-Leader, had been campaigning in print against Air Guard flyovers. Editorials had been calling those flyovers noisy and unsafe. What if a jet should crash? The editor had asked his readers, what if a jet should crash? And that's when Major Duncan Kearns invited the skeptical editor on a civic leader orientation flight. Invited him to go along to demonstrate how utterly safe Air Guard maneuvers really are. By the way, the executive editor of the Argus-Leader is Ward Bushy. That's right. He is Major Kearns' best friend. Or was. And now you know the rest of the story.
The rest of the story. Louisa was a young immigrant woman yearning for adventure and opportunity in the new world. Her family trip by sailing ship had been a perilous one, but the journey and the home across the sea she had left behind were fading memories now. All that mattered was today, and today would be Louisa's last day. It was a cranial injury that ended her life, caused by what we cannot know, for Louisa, the immigrant girl, lived and died at the age of 20, 10,000 years ago. And for as many years she was forgotten. Until in 1999, her skull was unearthed in Brazil, and by archaeological inference, her story was told. But the September announcement of that discovery by Brazil's National Museum sent shockwaves around the anthropological world, for Louisa's chin was pronounced. Her nose was large. Her eyes were round. And so, now we know, and for certain, that she resembled in no way the so-called Indians we associate with South America. For you see, Louisa was African. Now hold on. How can that be? Well, the experts scrambling for an explanation remembered an enigmatic rock drawing dating back to Louisa's era, a sketch on stone made around 8000 BC and found in Australia. The Australian Aborigines were descended from Africans. Anyway, this ancient drawing was of a boat with a prow, apparently designed for ocean voyages. So it's likely, at least, that one down under summer 10 millennia ago, Louisa's kind, and perhaps Louisa herself, set sail across the massive South Pacific, eventually discovering and exploring and finally settling in South America. So the first global explorers were of African descent? Yes, it now appears that way. But if that is so, then white explorers may not have been all that far behind. In April 1994, the issue of Discover magazine stunned its readers with a related revelation, published color photographs of 3,000-year-old mummies, one of which was that of a 55-year-old male with light brown hair and pale white skin. He was 6 feet 6 inches tall, and he was discovered where? In China. Then in 1996, archaeologists uncovered in the banks of the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, the skeleton of a 9,000-year-old man. And his skull displays Caucasian characteristics, indicating that he, too, originally had come from somewhere in Europe. So the voyage of Louisa and the prehistoric people migration that her journey represents bear a significance that we are only now beginning to appreciate. For the Indians, the ones to whom we refer as Native Americans, they showed up between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago, merely suggesting, mind you, that it was they who marched across the Bering Land Bridge from Asia and swiped the Americas from the Africans and from the Europeans, maybe even battled and buried them to do it. Oh, I know you learned in school and ever since that invaders from across the sea, Spanish, French, and English, stole North, Central, and South America from their rightful owners.